Well, hello and welcome to the Wyoming Tribune Eagle editorial board's interviews with the candidates for Wyoming governor who have challengers in the August 21st primary. I'm Brian Martin, the newspaper's managing editor, and we're here with Mary Throne, Democratic candidate for governor. Thank you, Ms. Throne, for agreeing to join us and for your candidacy.
Well, and thank you for the opportunity, Brian. I appreciate it.
We're also joined in the room today by Rory Palm, who's the regional president of APG Media of the Rockies, and Rachel Martinez, a community representative on the editorial board, and we're glad to have them here. The editorial board members who aren't here today will be watching the video later on. And we're also joined by Katie Cull, a member of our reporting team, who's going to be monitoring the Facebook Live feed and curating questions from our online audience for questioning toward the end of our hour together today. Before we launch into questions, I wanted to have just a few reminders here for our online audience. Because these interviews are being live streamed, we have provided the editorial board's questions to the candidates in advance so that no one was at a disadvantage for interviewing early in the process. Also, we've asked the candidates to try to limit their answers to each question to 2 minutes in order to get to as many topics as possible, and also to allow time for questions from our online audience toward the end of the interview. This isn't an award show though, so we'll be watching the time and signaling the candidate when they've reached 2 minutes, but we won't be interrupting with any orchestra music. So don't worry about being cut off, no buzzers, no beepers, Ms. Throne. Finally,
No
in addition,
hooks.
No hooks, no dragging you off the screen. Finally, in addition to helping Wyoming voters decide who will get their vote later this summer, these editorial board interviews will be the basis of our recommendations, and we will make recommendations in both the Democratic and Republican primary races. Those editorials are currently scheduled to be published in the paper in mid-July. That's it for now, so if you're ready, Ms. Throne, we'll get started with the questions, shall we?
Okay.
All right, so please start out by giving us just a couple minutes about you and your background.
I'm a Wyoming native. I was raised on a ranch in Campbell County on Wild Horse Creek. I spent my early years there working on the ranch. You know, this time of year I'd be haying, most likely, or fixing fence,
Right.
and getting sunburned. But I left Gillette to go to college and law school. I spent 2 years in Thailand as a volunteer in mission with the Presbyterian Church. Eventually, I found my way back to Wyoming in 1992, which was my goal. I ended up here in Cheyenne, and I think it was about 2 weeks after I moved to Cheyenne, I met my husband at the Albany bar, of all places. And I'm glad that happened. We've had a wonderful marriage with 3 incredible sons who are 22, 20, and 17. I always forget the youngest one. Sorry, Patrick. And my husband, Kevin Boyce, is a geologist. I went to work as an attorney, first with the Attorney General's office, and then into private practice. My specialty is energy and natural resources, and that's an expertise that I certainly would bring to the governor's office. In 2006, I ran for the legislature and served House District 11 here in Laramie County for 10 years. I spent 6 years of my 10 years in leadership positions in the legislature. And I went into the legislature initially because of my concerns with education. I was one of 2 mothers with children at home in the legislature at the time I went in, and one of very few parents who had children in the K-12 system, and I thought it was important to bring that perspective to public life. And I, in the legislature, developed a reputation for working across the aisle and just doing whatever it takes to get the job done, and that's what I would hope to do as governor.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Throne. Why do you want the job? Why do you want to be governor of Wyoming?
So for the last few years I was in the legislature, I noticed a couple of issues, concerns that really propelled me into the race. First of all, we make ourselves a boom and bust state. The decisions that our elected leaders make forever consign us to being a boom and bust state. And the only way to break that cycle is to change how we think and to stop going down the same old paths and expecting a different result. But since the price of oil plummeted in late 2014, 2015, early 2015. I have seen our leaders do what they've done every single time. And being a native of Campbell County, I probably lived through a bust by the time I hit junior high, maybe even elementary school. We just hunker down and we wait for the next boom. And that is not a plan, it's a dream. But I have a more fundamental reason for jumping into the race, a more organic reason that I think is equally as important as any policy concerns. And that is that our politics in Wyoming have started to become toxic. They've started to become too much like the national scene, too much in the way of litmus test politics, either my way or the highway. And that is not how you solve problems. Wyoming cannot get itself out of this boom and bust cycle that has been our history when people aren't willing to come to the table and find solutions to problems. And so that's why I decided to run.
Thank you. How do you differentiate yourself from your challengers?
Well, I think it's both in terms of my qualifications and my approach to the job. I have the most knowledge of any of the candidates in the race regarding our leading industry, which is energy. I have legislative experience, which no one else has. And a governor who doesn't understand the legislature and can't get their agenda through the legislature is not going to be successful. And I have a track record. I was in the minority, and sometimes extreme minority, the entire time I was in the legislature. And I learned how to build consensus and to solve problems. And I think that's something that I will take to the governor's office. In addition, and I think this is perhaps most important, I will be a governor that's independent of party. We have too much partisanship in our governing in Wyoming and in the country. I'm running to put the public interest ahead of any particular party's interests. I'm running to represent all of the people of the Wyoming, not a particular party. And Wyoming has a long history of electing independent-minded governors, and it actually works better when we have governors who are of a different party than the majority party.
Ms. Ron, what's your vision for the state of Wyoming?
So my vision for the state of Wyoming is for us to take advantage of the incredible opportunities we have as a state. Right now, this is a time of challenge for Wyoming, as our leading industries, coal, oil, and natural gas, are all facing economic headwinds over which we as a state have no control. And so my vision for Wyoming is that we take control of our destiny and that we take advantage of all the opportunities across the state so the entire state can prosper, not just one particular sector. And I think there are a lot of opportunities available to Wyoming. But again, we cannot go down the same old paths that we have always gone down before and expect a different result. It will take dramatic change to break us out of the boom and bust cycle. And I think that if we do that, we'll achieve those elusive goals that we've heard about, I think, in every political election since I'm old enough to remember, which is, diversifying the economy, creating opportunities for young people to move back to Wyoming. We can do those things. We can make it possible for my 3 sons, once they've had their adventures, to move back to Wyoming and build lives here. We can make it possible for all the University of Wyoming grads who are on the Front Range right now and who want to be in Wyoming to move back here. But we have to fundamentally change how we approach our situation and take advantage of all the opportunities Wyoming has to offer.
There are probably other questions coming up that are going to allude to that, but if we don't get to that, we may follow up in a bit. We're going to jump to, if you're elected, what are your priorities for the first 100 days in office?
Well, I think any governor who's elected in this election in November needs to be ready to go the first day on the job, and actually probably, and I plan to be getting to work the day after the election. Ironically, this year, the legislature starts the day after inauguration. I don't remember that happening before, but I actually looked at the calendar and went, oh my goodness. So I think I'm best suited to be able to handle that transition. And so I think the first 100 days for me will really start in November, not in January. And the first task will be getting ready for the legislature and developing a legislative agenda. I think too often new governors lose that first legislative session, and I don't want that to happen. And I think I'm best suited to accomplish immediate goals. I think one of the first ones would be, and we'll talk about this more later, but Medicaid expansion, stabilizing local government, getting our fiscal house in order, and looking for immediate legislative opportunities that can move the state forward. Apart from the legislature, I think it's important that we reach out to 50 existing businesses in the state of Wyoming, just as a ballpark number, to see what they need to grow their businesses in Wyoming, as well as reach out to 50 new businesses. And the existing business front, I would focus on trying to get a pilot project here that would take advantage of available carbon capture and sequestration credits. I think we can talk more about that when we talk about coal, but I think that will be an immediate goal of mine. And also going back to the legislative agenda, making sure that we focus on broadband across the state.
What do you plan to do with the Governor Matt Mead's Endow initiative? Is it important to you? If so, why? And if not, why not?
It is an important effort, and I would continue it, but I think I would probably tweak it a little bit. First of all, I feel like we need Endow now, meaning that there are decisions that have to be made now. In fact, decisions that probably should have been made 2 years ago to stabilize Wyoming's situation. And Endow can't do the job of the elected officials. Elected officials have decisions that they need to make. But to the extent Endow comes up with useful suggestions for moving the state forward, I think any governor and legislature would be foolish not to take advantage of them. But also, I think it's important that we broaden the participation in Endow. I'm impressed with the Engage group that just sort of organically came forward and said, you don't have enough younger people involved in this. But another group that I think is missing, maybe a couple of groups, we don't have a lot of community leader involvement. By that I mean mayor, city council. That's really where the heart and soul of Wyoming is in our local communities. So I think maybe more local government representation would be important, and maybe just a little more diversity, both ethnically and culturally and from a business perspective.
Mr. Ron, some experts believe that it's not possible to successfully diversify the economy without changing its tax structure. Do you agree with that? And if so, what changes would you propose to Wyoming's tax structure? And
I do agree with that, and I think not some experts, but most experts would tell you that we cannot diversify the economy and really change our future without broadening the tax base. I think I've said that from the beginning. The REMI report that recently came out with in front of the Revenue Committee, confirmed that. We now have data and analysis to back up what I think most of us knew. The truth of the matter is, if you're not named coal, oil, or natural gas in the state of Wyoming, we don't tax you very much. And so if we bring in new businesses to Wyoming, particularly if we bring in, I think, the kind of businesses we want, businesses that provide a lot of jobs and that will attract young families to Wyoming. If they don't add to the tax base, then it's going to cost us to provide the basic public services to those employees, particularly education. So we have to have that discussion. It's not an easy discussion, but I don't think you're a good leader if you aren't honest with the people.
Do you think this is an issue that, obviously it differs between the parties, but is this going to separate you from your counterparts across the aisle, and how would you bridge that if you head into a legislative session with a majority of Republicans who don't
Right.
want to increase taxes?
Well, I think it does differentiate me, from the field. It puts me in Republican company, however, because Governor Meade has said we need to change our tax structure. But before Governor Meade said it, some very conservative Republicans said the same thing. Chairman Madden of the Revenue Committee has been saying this for years. Now Senator Peterson, who's his co-chairman, actually commented at the last Revenue Committee meeting that we have to start this discussion. And I think it's important, even if I don't make immediate progress, that I take this issue to the people and just present them with the options. Do you want good schools? Do you want your roads fixed? Do you want decent highways? How are we going to pay for them? That's, I think, talking about how to pay your bills is a fundamentally conservative approach to life and to government. So I think if we can at least get the discussion going, because what we've done in the past, and like I said, I came back in the 90s, so that was one of the worst downturns in the state had had for a long time. We basically spent all our money, and then we were desperate. There was a time in the 90s when they balanced the budget because a really wealthy person died in Jackson, and our share of the federal estate tax came to just what we needed to balance the budget. And if we let ourselves get to that point again, it's going to be a lot tougher. And also, when it comes to things like Endow, we won't have the resources to make the necessary investments to move the state forward if we're flat broke.
We are pretty easygoing here. Don't be afraid to grab the water bottle. Get
Okay.
yourself some refreshments. As
I might
needed.
just do
I don't want
that.
you just talk and talk and talk. I know
Oh, I
how
can
hard it
talk
is
a
to
lot.
do that, so make sure you get that. Stay hydrated. Next question is, how would you help guarantee stability for funding local governments, so cities, towns, and counties? You've alluded to it a little bit, but what specifically would you do to guarantee their revenue streams?
So this is another issue that helped propel me into the governor's race. I have noticed that as times become tighter, the legislature starts treating cities, towns, and counties like second-class citizens. Makes them sort of beg for money. And my view is that we're all in this together. The local governments provide the bulk of the services, and we need to come together and determine, and you have to bring the cities and towns and counties together, which is no easy task, but I think leadership from a governor can help on that front, just bringing everybody together and talking about what do we need to do as governments, and how do we figure out how we're best going to provide those services. But when it comes to the state funding level, I have a track record on this issue. I have a bill that was actually co-sponsored with Mike. Actually, this one was co-sponsored with Kathy Conley, but I believe Representative Madden supported it. But we wanted to raise the cap on severance tax money that flows to cities, towns, and counties, because that cap was set in 2000 and it's never been changed. So that means the value of that money has eroded over time. So while state spending has increased to deal with inflation, we've been sending the same amount of money to local governments. And that really doesn't make sense. So that wouldn't amount to a lot of money, but it would give them a more reliable source of revenue. I think we also have to continue to provide the $105 million in direct distribution. Those are both sort of stopgaps, but then we need to look at giving local governments the tools to raise their own revenue, which they can't do now. But even that is not a solution that will protect everyone, because our small communities are not going to have a lot of ability to raise revenue. Pine Bluffs is not going to be able to generate a lot of sales tax revenue on its own. And so we will have to continue to support our small communities at the state level, because our small communities are part of who we are as a state.
Recent reports indicate fewer U.S. utilities are using coal for power generation due to the abundance of natural gas and renewables. With this decline in coal's domestic use, do you support the continued investment in the coal industry and new technology, and how would you support that if you are in favor of that?
I am in favor of that, and I have a history of supporting those efforts. I was part of a leadership team that developed Wyoming's landmark carbon capture and sequestration legislation several years ago. And that can provide the legal foundation for future projects. We need to have a governor who's willing to take a lead on getting a carbon capture and sequestration project here. We have a number of units at our power plants that might be susceptible to that, but it's going to take a massive public-private partnership. There are tax credits available at the federal level, both on the carbon capture side. The section number is 45Q, for what that's worth. And then there are, if you compare those with enhanced oil recovery tax credits, it makes it profitable, or at least economically feasible, maybe not profitable, to pursue these. Because we cannot continue to bury our heads in the sand when it comes to the challenges that coal faces. We have to make coal part of the climate solution, not part of the climate problem. I would also continue to support the efforts of the ITC in Campbell County. I supported those efforts. So we have to continue to make those new investments, and then also support industries that want to look for different uses of coal, whether that's in manufacturing or other innovative uses.
So Ron, where do you stand on regulating and taxing renewable energy production such as wind and solar?
So I oppose a specific tax on renewable energy. This idea that we want to tax them to make up the lost ground from declining coal and other mineral revenue is really pretty absurd. It basically chases them out of the state. If you look at a state like Texas, Texas is, I think, #1 in wind, and they remain certainly in the top 2 or 3 in oil and gas. I'm guessing they're probably #1. So we can do both of those things. But we have to look, as I said earlier, at broadening our tax base. But I wouldn't just single out the renewable energy industry as the way to broaden that tax base. And I think that has been my consistent position for the entire time I was in the legislature and since I've started running for governor.
And before we leave the energy issues, what are your thoughts on climate change, and what would your plans be to address climate change in Wyoming?
I think the climate is changing, and the markets are responding in kind when it comes to, again, coal, oil, and natural gas. So we have to be a leader in all forms of energy and energy policy development. We have to advocate for our industries, and as I said, make them part of the climate solution. I think that we can be much more successful in persuading the state of Washington, for example, to allow an export port if we've made coal part of a climate solution and not a climate problem. And also, we should look into options for our nuclear industry. Small-scale nuclear reactors are available, and obviously the economics have to be there, but I think that's something that could be beneficial for Wyoming and the climate. And the small-scale nuclear reactors have fewer, I think, environmental concerns than compared to what we think of as the 3 Mile Island huge nuclear reactor. So I think that those are all things we should look at. And again, just sort of broader efforts. Like I said, I grew up on a ranch. My parents were raised during the Depression. They were fundamentally conservative in how they approach life. I think things like energy efficiency and incentives for energy efficiency are sort of low-hanging fruit in the climate debate. And we've always been afraid in Wyoming to even talk about those things. I mean, not so much at the local level. Here in Laramie County, we have a LEED certified library. But we need to expand that across the state, that kind of thinking.
Let's shift gears and ask, as governor, how would you address education funding challenges? It's obviously one that the legislature has been grappling with for a few sessions now, but what are your ideas?
Well, I guess I would say that they haven't really grappled with them. They've put a Band-Aid on it, probably deepened the wound in some respects, but maybe attempted a small Band-Aid on education and basically kick the can down the road. So we cannot continue to do that. But I think the first thing that a governor needs to do is celebrate public education in Wyoming. Wyoming's education system is ranked 7th in the country, according to Ed Week. The economic development experts will tell you that one of the leading drivers for economic development is the strength of your K-12 public education system. So if we want to attract young families here, we have to keep our education system strong. Our most recent NAEP scores, nationalists, whatever the silly acronym stands for, but it's a national test where our students have been outperforming many other states, especially the 4th graders. Those are all things we should celebrate. Is our education system perfect? Of course not. But let's not tear down what is working and what will be key to our future success. So we have to deal with the education funding shortfall. I think I'll give some credit to my former colleague, Speaker Harshman. I think he showed incredible leadership on this subject and found some revenue streams to kind of stabilize the funding, and I think his approach as an initial step is important. Basically maximizing our investment income that flows into education, and also taking more advantage of the income from our state lands in the form of royalties and leases, getting that more into the account that funds education. But we really, it goes back to broadening the tax structure. And our property taxes across the board are some of the lowest, except on the minerals industry, are some of the lowest in the country. And we need to start that discussion.
We just have the 2 minutes on that question, but just a quick follow-up. How do cuts factor in for you at all? Because there's been talk about we don't need to find more money for education, we need to cut expenses.
I think that's an area where the public has been misled. The public's been told we have a few too many high-paid administrators, and if we just got rid of them, that it would all be okay. But the legislature spent money studying education again, and our funding. We have worked since the early 2000s to build up a system for equitable funding across the state. The state has a constitutional obligation to fund education, and we have to meet that constitutional obligation. Do we want class sizes with over 30 kids in the classroom? Do we want teachers, do we want to lose good teachers because they go someplace else for more money? That's where we are. It's not just a matter of, getting rid of the assistant superintendent of whatever, and it'll all be okay.
Moving on, you mentioned broadband very briefly as being a priority for you. How big of a priority is it, and if it's important, how would you make it happen?
Well, I think it's essential to Wyoming's future. The great thing about campaigning for governor is traveling across the state. And while each community has unique opportunities and unique challenges, the one consistent thing across the state, the one consistent item that they are lacking is adequate connectivity. And I don't think we can grow our economy. We can't bring small businesses in. It's not just a matter of trying to bring in new tech businesses, but allowing our existing businesses, whether it's the rancher in northeastern Wyoming or the small business woman in Sweetwater County, to have them access to the technology so they can grow their businesses. And this is going to take, I think, a tremendous effort. The Endow initiatives, which were implemented through SF 100, are a good start. But we'll have to, look at their report, which I think is due in early September, and see, what more needs to be done. I think we'll probably have to put more funding in to really make it happen. The National League of Cities did a report a couple years ago that basically said that the urban-rural divide is and the success of urban communities versus rural communities is due to lack of broadband. So we can really bring those two economies together. Cheyenne is in a different position than any other community in the state, and our success can be used to help rural economies. So I think looking at what the broadband initiative comes up with is important. Second, we need to make sure we maximize our use of federal funds, the universal service funds that are available in rural economies. And then look for public and private partnerships that will work. But we have to solve this problem. Broadband is not a luxury. It's a necessity, like electricity, in this day and age. And the only way to build the economy of the future is to have the broadband of the future.
How would you address challenges related to providing health care to Wyoming residents?
In 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes or less. Solve the health care problem.
Well, I'm not going to solve the health care problem in 2 minutes or less, but I've been a strong proponent of Medicaid expansion and continue to believe that Wyoming needs to do that as a first step to both get health care across the board to underserved populations, to stabilize our hospitals, but also to stabilize our insurance rates. States that have expanded Medicaid are doing better than those that have not. Is it going to solve all the problems? Of course not, but will it help? And I think we always have an obligation to do what will help. The state has lost roughly $500 million in federal money that is ours by not expanding Medicaid. When the county commissioners, the Business Alliance, the medical community, and the advocates for the poor are all on the same side of the issue, it should tell you something, and we should just expand Medicaid. But beyond that, we do have to look at how we can stabilize our insurance rates. Small businesses can't afford to start in Wyoming because our healthcare costs are too high. If you're an entrepreneur with a steady job, with health benefits, and you've got a creative idea, it's very hard for you to take that risk and pursue your dream if you don't know if your family's going to have health care coverage or if it's going to be so expensive you can't afford it. So we have to deal with this issue. There are some initiatives underway with the State Department of Insurance to pursue some waivers that have worked in other states to stabilize insurance rates. I'd certainly want to continue to pursue those, but also work with a group of bipartisan governors nationwide to deal more with the national issues. I was pretty horrified recently that I don't believe any leader in Wyoming spoke out against the current administration's efforts to remove protection for pre-existing conditions. I mean, really. I am the proud owner of a pre-existing condition as a cancer survivor, and that is appalling to me.
Ms. Throne, if a marijuana legalization bill passed the Wyoming legislature and came to your desk as governor, would you sign it? Why or why not?
So I have said, I think whenever asked, that I support the legalization of medical marijuana, well-regulated medical marijuana. I also support decriminalization, and I have a legislative voting record on those issues, but I do not believe Wyoming is ready for full-scale legalization of marijuana. I'd like the other states to work out all the issues before we take it on as the least populated state in the country. And I'd also like to say that it's not constitutional for the governor to threaten a veto of a bill, so while I'm campaigning, I'm trying to resist answering whether I would sign or not sign something. And I also know from being in the legislature that you always have to see the bill. I mean, you can support the concept of a piece of legislation, but then by the time it's done, you don't like it anymore because it just hasn't turned out in print the way you expected.
So this is by extension, it sounds like you believe that chronically ill patients should be allowed to use CBD and cannabis
Yes.
products as well.
Yes, and in fact, there are even products that are going through FDA approval to control, the horrible seizures, epileptic seizures that children have, and certainly we'd want those to be available in Wyoming.
What do you think of the current way liquor sales are handled in Wyoming, and does it need to change, and if so, how?
Well, let's see, is prohibition over? Yes. For many years ago, that was, and I'm a history major, I should know that off the top of my head. But in any event, I think our liquor license laws have to be examined, for the modern era. It's complicated because the government has created this market for liquor licenses, this constrained market for liquor licenses, and many businesses have spent a lot of money on their liquor licenses and made investment decisions based on that. And so I'm not saying we tear it apart without consideration of those current liquor license holders. But we're harming our ability of our communities to grow their downtowns with archaic liquor license laws that again really date from prohibition. Certainly we need to give our communities more tools, and liquor licenses are another tool they can use, and they can regulate how many they want. So we need to look at sort of wholesale review of those. The other thing that's sort of interesting to me is, we have all these distilleries popping up around, and I've been known to taste test at a few of them. I'm never driving. But, they have to ship their product. My understanding is they have to ship their product to Cheyenne to get it stamped and then ship it back, to their location before they can sell it. I think those, now that we have these microbreweries and small distilleries in Wyoming, I think we need to look at a more business-friendly way of handling that situation.
How important is providing commercial air service to Wyoming communities? And if it's important, how, as governor, would you help make it happen? If not, why not?
Oh, maybe we just all need personal drones. That would make it a lot simpler. But that's not going to happen immediately. In addition to broadband, the other concern I hear in communities across the state is the need for better commercial air service. I think, again, the Endow initiative, which was actually sort of blessing something that our Wyoming Department of Transportation came up with, is a good start. Again, because we are the least populated state, we have to put more effort into these things. The market is not going to drive commercial air service in Wyoming, and we're going to have to continue to nudge it along.
Not a super popular idea in Cheyenne right now, as you've probably seen.
No, and Cheyenne's, of course, different than, Cheyenne's not Riverton.
Right. But among the critics, so it's interesting. So you're in support of government subsidies to to get
I
this
think,
thing
yeah,
started.
I think we have to.
Excuse me. Okay. What's your position on gun control measures to protect citizens in public venues? Do you believe that locations like the University of Wyoming should be able to pass restrictions on gun possession on their facilities? And where do you stand on that issue?
So, just to preface my remarks on that, I grew up with a gun behind the back door on the ranch. And, my family owns firearms. My husband and sons hunt, and certainly those are activities I support and would continue to promote in Wyoming. So I always like people to understand that I am not taking away anybody's guns, no matter what may be said about me out there in the social media world. That being said, I have consistently voted to allow to exercise their own discretion on this issue. I'm not running to be the trustee or the chairman of the board of the trustees for the University of Wyoming. I'm running to appoint those people, and they know best, as do the community college board trustees, what they want for their facilities. And then certainly when it comes to a private organization like CFD, which is a private organization, I'm not going to tell them how to manage safety at their venues.
What's your position on the transfer of federal lands to the state and management of those lands?
I oppose the transfer of federal lands unequivocally. Wyoming does not have the resources to pay for the management of those federal lands, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that our public lands remain in public hands. It's why we live here. It's our heritage. And again, for those people who enjoy the outdoors, for people who like to hunt and fish, primarily those activities occur on public lands. But as governor, I would certainly advocate to protect all the uses of public lands. As an energy attorney, I understand the frustration of the energy industry in dealing with overlapping regulations, and I would certainly look to eliminate any overlapping regulations and to develop a good relationship with the federal land managers to make sure that the interests of our local communities, the agricultural community, and the energy community are all addressed. It's really a question of balance. We know how to do that in Wyoming. We don't need DC, no matter who's in DC, telling us what we need in Wyoming, and the governor is always going to have to advocate for what's in the best interests of Wyoming.
How do you plan to work with and communicate with those of us in the media, as well as legislators and citizens in the state, if you're elected governor?
Well, I have a track record, I think, of during my 10 years in the legislature of always being accessible to the press and to my constituents, and working hard to build relationships with legislators. Certainly, again, if I'm elected, I'll be reaching out to legislators, the newly elected legislators and my old friends, the day after the election to congratulate them and to start building that relationship, because that's really what it's all about. When you're dealing with the legislature, it's about building the relationships. And again, I have a track record of doing that, so no one has to guess how I'll behave. When it comes to the press, I like to be accessible to the press. I like to return phone calls. I realize that it's an arm's length relationship, and we have to keep it an arm's length relationship in order for you to do your job and for me to do mine. But it doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. And again, when it comes to citizens, I think it's important for the governor to be accessible. And, whether I do events like this, Facebook Live, or town halls, I think when the governor goes into a community, you can't just go to the chamber or the Rotary and talk, because those are member organizations. You have to get out into the public. And I think that's what nearly every governor of Wyoming has always done. I guess I'd also add that my cell number has not changed since I was in the legislature, and it's on my business cards. And if you call me, I will either answer immediately or return the call.
Before we turn to the live audience, what other topics or issues would you like to address with the editorial board that we haven't covered so far today?
Well, you've certainly covered a lot of them. But I think it's important, as we sit here in Cheyenne, to remember the rest of the state and the entire rest of the state. The communities across the state, whether you're in Hewlett, on the reservation, or in Evanston, are all struggling. And we need a governor who really considers the needs of all the communities. The reservation in particular is unique. Its relationships with two sovereign nations, and I think just my background as an attorney and as being able to work with different groups, really focusing on the needs of individual communities and being sensitive to what they need is something that the next governor needs to do.
Well, at this point, I'm going to turn to Katie and see what questions we have from the live audience on Facebook that are different from what we've already addressed today.
Great. Well, you guys out there in Facebook land did a good job of keeping it to not topics that we've covered already. So
Oh, dear.
You get some good curveballs.
Okay.
No, they're not. So we'll start with this one from Regina Dixon. She wants to know, she says, state employees have gone nearly 6 years without so much as a cost of living raise. What do you see as appropriate regarding the wages of state employees?
Regina, thank you for that question, because I should have covered that in the other topics discussion. Again, state employees will vote with their feet. They will leave the state. We already have severe public employee shortages, in two key facilities. The prison in Rollins, we can't keep enough guards, so we've shipped prisoners to private prisons. That makes no sense. And, at the state hospital in Evanston. We can't continue to expect our employees to do more. We've cut jobs, so people are doing extra work now. I think, we have to pay people what the market requires. We have a system in place for market-based pay. And then again, whenever times get tough, the state employees bear the brunt of it. And they'll leave. And then it'll cost us more money because we have to train new people.
So since budgets are tight right now, where do you find the money to give those raises?
Well, again, I think we have to deal with our revenue situation. And we have basically a budget shortfall. It's wildly varying estimates, but the most reasonable number I've seen when you consider all the sources of revenue is probably about $380 million, not the $1.1 billion number that gets thrown about as being the structural deficit. That's because people only look at one fund, the general fund. So I think, again, we need to transition to a broader revenue structure. We really need to start with a different question. The question needs to be, what do we want government to do? What do we have to pay for it? And then how do we fill the gaps? And so I voted against the 2016 budget in the legislature, not because it didn't spend enough, but because it was fiscally irresponsible. And we need to stop being fiscally irresponsible. We need to manage our money better. We need to take care of our employees, and we need to take care of the needs of the people of Wyoming and not throw out this phony argument of we just have to live within our means.
Next question.
Okay. So Jordan Evans, you kind of touched on this before, but this is a little bit more drilling down into specifics. How do you see making our communities more livable for coming generations? What is the state's role in attracting young people back to the state?
Well, Jordan, thank you for that question. I think that the state's role is, and the community's role is, creating communities that people want to live in, and helping to create the environment where opportunities will grow. Again, we can't attract young people back to the state if we think we're going to continue to just be a coal, oil, and natural gas producing state. Because those three things are facing economic challenges, and so we have to adjust accordingly. But we have to encourage and assist communities in amenities like parks and greenways, making our communities nice places to live, maintaining those outdoor recreational opportunities on our public lands and in our state parks. Creating a climate that attracts people to the state. Making sure we have enough fire and police protection. Just the basics is the way we can. And again, going back to the liquor law question, people will move to communities if there's something for them to do. I think another issue that I didn't touch on that's related a little bit to Jordan's question is you also have to attract families, you have to have opportunities for both people in the relationship. And our lack of opportunity for women in this state means that, if the husband has a job opportunity and the wife doesn't, then maybe they don't come. And so that also is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Great. Do we have time for another one?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. Richard Johnson would like to know, what are your thoughts on cryptocurrency?
Thank you, Richard.
A softball question for you.
I think that, I appreciate what the legislature did this last session, making us a blockchain hub. I think we have to watch that. Wyoming needs to take advantage of all economic opportunities, and that appears to be one that, we're kind of on the ground floor, so we should continue to pursue that.
Patrick Ramirez would like to know, would you oppose as governor the construction of a detention center in Evanston for undocumented immigrants?
We just had a discussion of this topic in Evanston 2-3 days ago. And my position is that whenever you're in a leadership position, and the toughest decisions are when your principles come into conflict. One of my principles, which I think I've alluded to, is that that Cheyenne should not always be telling communities what to do. They have to be given the tools to make their own decisions to grow their communities. That being said, I oppose private prisons. The ICE facility planned in Evanston is a private prison. I don't think it's healthy economic development. It's very close to a state park, which I think does implicate state interests. But I think it's just, I had a long conversation after the event in Evanston with a city councilwoman from Evanston who supported it, who basically said they felt like they had to do something, and all the other options that had been presented to them ended up going someplace else. Weatherby went to Sheridan. I mean, they were on the short list for some other economic development opportunities. I think the real problem is, again, we've left communities like Evanston out. We need to find them good economic development opportunities. I don't think that they're wild about this ICE facility. I think they just felt like it was the only option they had available to them. And a governor needs to take a lead on that and find them better opportunities.
We have about 5 more minutes, so if you have any other questions.
We'd actually covered most of these in previous questions. So when you folks, when we are done here, you are going to be able to go back and watch the rest of it. So if you want to hear about Medicaid expansion or gun safety, you can go back in the conversation and listen to those. So
good reminder. Great, thanks, Katie. And just a reminder for the live audience that we are going to archive this interview on our website, wyomingnews.com. We also have your candidate announcement story back from when you announced, and there are other election-related resources there too. We're coming up on absentee voting, I think starting July 6th, so we wanted to get these interviews out there so folks are informed. Any other issues or any other topics that you wanted to cover today, Ms. Roan, before we wrap up?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody in the room for participating and your kind attention, and also thanks to everybody watching on Facebook.
And thanks for the great questions. We appreciate it. Thank you.